Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're plunging into a topic that feels incredibly relevant right now. The political economy of imperial decline. We're talking about why even the, greatest powers eventually crumble, how their economic muscles can wither, and their political structures fray.
Right. It's a story as old as time, really, but the patterns are surprisingly consistent across different civilizations.
And our mission today is to give you a shortcut, sort of, to understanding those patterns. We've pulled together insights from a stack of incredible sources.
There.
Everything from Paul Kennedy's classic, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, to Acemoglu and Robinson's Why Nations Fail.
Both excellent reads.
Absolutely. And we're going to extract the most important nuggets, really, to show you how economic and political factors aren't just contributing to imperial collapse,
Right.
but they're often driving it in this really complex, interwoven dance.
Okay, so as you looked across these different works, what was the most surprising recurring pattern you found? And why do you think it's so fundamental to imperial decline? That's a great question. And it immediately brings us to the core, really. You can boil it down to about 8 main features that just keep showing up again and again.
8, okay.
Yeah. And the fundamental dynamic seems to be this dangerous cocktail, if you like, of internal decay mixing with external pressure.
Creating a spiral.
Exactly. A reinforcing downward spiral.
Yeah.
So first up, there's fiscal overextension and military overstretch.
Right, spending too much.
Put simply, yeah. Empires expand militarily, right? But eventually, the rising costs of defense just outstrip their economic capacity.
Makes sense.
Think of Rome's vast borders, constantly draining its treasury, needing ever more legions, more resources. Or look at Britain after the 2 world wars. Crippling debts that fundamentally reshaped its global standing.
So the military might become a weakness.
It can become an empire's Achilles heel, yes, if it's not checked by economic reality.
Okay, what's number 2?
Second, we see institutional decay and extractive economies. These are systems basically designed to exploit resources. Think feudalism or colonial exploitation.
Right.
But paradoxically, they often stifle innovation back home.
How does that work?
Well, elites capture the wealth. They hoard it instead of investing it productively, leading to economic stagnation.
Ah.
The Spanish Empire's reliance on New World silver, for instance. It famously hindered its domestic industry because, well, it was easier to import than to innovate.
Got it.
Or you see the widespread corruption that was just endemic in Rome's later bureaucracy.
Right, things just seizing up.
Precisely. Third is inequality and social fragmentation.
A big one today, too.
Definitely. When wealth concentrates heavily in the hands of a small elite, it severely reduces social mobility. And, crucially, it fuels widespread unrest among the population.
Yeah.
The erosion of a middle class weakens the entire state's stability.
Any historical examples spring to mind?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Take Rome's latifundia, those huge privately owned estates. They displace small farmers, creating this landless, disaffected underclass.
Which then causes problems.
Big problems. Civil unrest, instability. Or think about industrial-era Britain. Severe inequality led to widespread labor strikes and deep social divisions.
Okay, so that's 3. What's next?
Fourth is trade disruptions and resource dependence.
So relying too much on one thing.
Exactly. Empires that become overly reliant on a few key resources become incredibly vulnerable to external shocks.
Like putting all your eggs in one basket.
Pretty much. Shifts in crucial trade routes can severely impact imperial revenues, sometimes almost overnight. Rome's dependence on Egyptian grain made it really susceptible to disruptions.
Right.
And the British Empire's reliance on colonial resources like Indian cotton created significant dependencies that, nationalist movements could exploit later on.
Okay, what's number 5?
Fifth, we encounter bureaucratic complexity and diminishing returns.
Ah, red tape.
You got it. Administrative systems can become so large, so intricate, so rigid that their cost eventually outweighs their benefits.
Yeah, you can imagine.
And innovation stagnates because the institutions start prioritizing control over adapting to new realities.
Any examples?
Consider the Byzantine bureaucracy. It became legendary for its labyrinthine procedures.
Right.
Or Ming China's rigid Confucian exam system. Very stable for a long time, but it hindered responsiveness when urgent crises hit.
Okay, number 6.
Sixth, there's geopolitical competition and systemic shifts. This one's pretty straightforward.
Few players on the block.
Exactly. Rival powers inevitably emerge, often with more efficient economic models or maybe different social structures. This global economic reordering leads to the displacement of dominant powers.
So someone gets overtaken.
Think of how Britain surpassed Spain as a global power,
Right.
and then how the U.S. eclipsed British power after World War II. It's a constant churn.
Okay. Almost there. Number 7.
Seventh is something we often call cultural complacency and loss of civic virtue. This one can be a bit more subtle.
How so?
Well, elites can become decadent, sort of detached from effective governance, focused maybe on their own pleasures. And you see a noticeable decline in social cohesion, in civic responsibility. It makes collective action really difficult.
Gibbon talked about this with Rome, didn't he?
He famously argued this for Rome, yeah, citing patrician corruption. We also see elements of it in the Ottoman millet system. It allowed different religious communities self-governance, which sounds good,
Right.
but it also led to internal fragmentation down the line.
Interesting. Okay, the last one. Number 8.
And finally, eighth, environmental and demographic stress. This often acts as an accelerant.
Pushing things over the edge.
Kind of.
Yeah.
Resource depletion, like Roman deforestation leading to land degradation.
Right.
Or population pressures, like the Ming Dynasty's famine crises, which were triggered partly by climate change and overpopulation. These don't usually cause the collapse on their own, but they can definitely worsen all the other factors.
Wow. Okay. It's almost chilling, really, how consistent these patterns are across millennia. So if we boil down these 8 patterns, what's the fundamental underlying dynamic? What's really going on?
Yeah, what really stands out is that these aren't isolated factors. Not at all. They interact cyclically.
Right. You mentioned the feedback loop.
Exactly. They form a kind of destructive feedback loop. Each weakness makes another one worse, creating this reinforcing downward spiral that becomes incredibly difficult to stop once it gains momentum.
That dynamic is exactly what's on my mind. How do these patterns actually play out when an empire finally crumbles? Let's dive into some specific cases, maybe comparing the actual falls of empires like, say, Rome, Britain, the Ottomans, and Spain.
Okay, yeah. When we compare the Spanish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Roman Empire, and the British Empire, the patterns are indeed striking. You see both common threads and, unique vulnerabilities for each.
Let's start with that fiscal overextension one. How did that look across these 4?
Okay. Take fiscal overextension. Spain experienced massive inflation from all that New World silver, the price revolution, historians call it.
Right, too much silver.
Basically, the Ottomans faced crippling costs from prolonged wars, like the huge siege of Vienna. Rome, well, they famously debased their currency. The silver content dropped to almost nothing, and they relied on increasingly expensive mercenary armies.
And Britain.
Britain, of course, was pretty much bankrupted by the 2 world wars, huge debts to the U.S. And then the Suez Crisis really exposed its inability to project power independently anymore.
So the striking similarity there.
All of them faced unsustainable military spending and mounting debt. It tells us that even the mightiest armies, crucial for expansion, can become that Achilles heel if the economics don't support it.
Okay, what about the institutional decay? How did that manifest?
For institutional decay, Spain suffered from rigid feudalism and that disastrous expulsion of Jews and Muslims.
Yeah.
A huge loss of human capital, really.
Yeah, economically devastating.
Totally. The Ottomans had a corrupt Timar system that's a land grant system, and the Janissaries, their elite military unit, actively blocked modernization. They even famously banned the printing press until 1727.
Wow. Resisting change.
Big time. Rome saw elite hoarding, rampant bureaucratic corruption. Britain, particularly post-WWII, experienced a decline in industrial competitiveness and a real rigidity in its colonial structures that made it hard to adapt.
And the similarity across all of those.
Elite self-interest and a failure to reform. It suggests that the ruling class's inability or maybe unwillingness to adapt is often a fatal flaw.
Okay, let's talk inequality. How did that play out?
In terms of inequality and fragmentation, Spain's rigid caste system in the colonies definitely sparked widespread revolts.
Right.
The Ottoman millet system, as we mentioned, led to fragmentation as different religious and ethnic groups resisted centralization efforts.
In Rome?
Rome's latifundia, the giant estates, created that vast, landless underclass and fueled brutal civil wars.
And Britain?
Britain, in the industrial era, saw severe inequality leading to widespread labor strikes. And later, nationalist movements shrewdly exploited these class and social divisions in its colonies.
So the common thread there is?
It's that deepening tension between the elites and the masses. It just weakens societal cohesion from within, making the whole structure more fragile.
Right. And what about trade and resources? How did dependence hurt them?
Trade disruptions and resource dependence also played a huge role. Spain's silver glut, paradoxically, made its own domestic exports uncompetitive compared to the rising manufacturing powers, like the Dutch and English.
Ah, interesting. The resource curse again.
Exactly. The Ottoman Empire suffered when new European sea routes bypassed the old Silk Road, cutting into its vital revenues.
Ah.
Rome, as we said, relied heavily on Egyptian grain, and instability along the Silk Road hurt its eastern trade revenues too.
And Britain.
Britain's dependence on colonial resources made it vulnerable to independence movements. Plus, a post-WWII dollar shortage really impacted its ability to pay for crucial imports.
So the consistent pattern is?
Empires often suffer when they rely too heavily on just a few critical resources or when global trade routes shift away from them. Vulnerability.
Okay, and the geopolitical shifts, being overtaken by rivals.
Yeah, geopolitical shifts were decisive for all of them. Spain saw the rise of Dutch and English naval power, culminating in the defeat of its armada.
A major turning point.
Huge. The Ottomans were increasingly outgunned by European industrial and military leaps, particularly by Russia and Austria.
Right.
Rome faced constant pressure from the powerful Persian Sassanids and was eventually overwhelmed by Germanic migrations.
And Britain, post-war.
Britain, post-1945, was simply eclipsed by the emerging superpowers, the U.S. and USSR. And nationalist movements made colonialism basically untenable.
So a common thread is simply being overtaken.
By rising, more dynamic powers, yes.
Okay, finally, that cultural failure point. How did that look?
Cultural and adaptive failure is crucial, yeah. Spain's Inquisition stifled new ideas and aggressively rejected Enlightenment reforms.
Holding on to the past.
Very much so. The Ottomans, as mentioned, resisted critical reforms, even something as fundamental as the printing press.
Incredible.
Rome, according to Gibbon anyway, succumbed partly to elite decadence and a loss of public spirit.
And Britain. Complacency.
Britain, certainly in its Victorian peak, had a kind of complacency underestimating rising rivals like the U.S. and Germany.
So the shared lesson there.
A profound resistance to change. A stubborn clinging to outdated beliefs and systems, even when the writing's on the wall.
So across these examples, we see these striking similarities like the resource curse, where easy money kills innovation, or innovation stagnation from rigid institutions, and this pervasive elite capture, where the ruling class just looks after itself.
Exactly. Those three themes are incredibly powerful and recurrent.
What's fascinating and maybe a bit unnerving is how these historical echoes might even apply to our present day. How do these patterns, looking through this comparative lens, maybe hint at dangers to U.S. hegemony today?
Yeah, you can draw some, let's say, unsettling parallels when you apply these historical lenses to contemporary challenges facing the U.S.
Like what?
Well, the Spanish parallel might suggest a risk from over-reliance on dollar seigniorage.
That's the benefit the U.S. gets from the dollar being the world's reserve currency, right?
Exactly. It's a unique economic advantage. But if other nations, say the BRICS countries, create viable alternatives, it could trigger a global de-dollarization. That would seriously challenge U.S. financial power, much like the silver inflation hurt Spain.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What about an Ottoman parallel?
The Ottoman parallel could point to political polarization paralyzing crisis response. We've seen increasing legislative gridlock and inability sometimes to pass significant reforms. That echoes how Ottoman internal divisions hindered their ability to react effectively to external threats.
Right, infighting while the house is burning.
Something like that. Then there's the British parallel, which highlights the danger of military overstretch.
How so? The spending isn't as high percentage-wise, is it?
Percentage of GDP is lower than historical peaks, true. But U.S. absolute spending still exceeds the next 10 nations combined. There are over 800 overseas bases. The argument is that this could be draining domestic investment that might otherwise go into infrastructure, education, R&D, similar to how Britain's imperial costs eventually became a burden.
Okay, and a Roman parallel.
And the Roman parallel warns of inequality eroding social cohesion. Events like the Capitol riots in 2021, regardless of one's politics, can be seen as a stark symptom of deep societal divisions, echoing the kind of internal fractures seen in late Rome.
And you mentioned a wild card.
Yeah, the modern wild card is digital fragmentation. Things like cyber warfare, disinformation campaigns, the ethical dilemmas of AI.
Yeah.
There's no direct historical parallel for that, and it adds a whole new layer of potential vulnerability.
So it's not just the grand sweep of history then. Can we actually spot a declining empire through, like, numbers? Or even just human nature? Are there specific economic indicators or even just behavioral patterns that signal decline before it's maybe too late?
Absolutely. Beyond the broad themes, there are specific key indicators of imperial decline we can track or at least look out for.
Okay, like what? Give me some numbers.
Right. For fiscal health, the single biggest red flag is probably a soaring debt-to-revenue ratio.
That is too high.
Well, when it's sustained above, say, 200% like it was in Rome's 3rd century crisis or post-WWII Britain, that's a huge warning sign. The modern U.S. debt-to-GDP ratio, which is a bit different but related, is currently around 123%.
Still high, but not 200%.
Not yet. We also look for rampant currency debasement and inflation. The Roman denarius, for example, saw its silver content plummet from nearly 100% to maybe 5% over centuries. That fueled hyperinflation.
In the modern equivalent.
In modern terms, you'd look for persistent core inflation above, say, 4%, coupled with a significant loss of reserve currency share, like the dollar share of global reserves falling from around 72% to 59% since 2001. That's a trend to watch.
Okay. What about military spending?
For military overstretch, defense spending as a percentage of GDP is crucial. Prolonged periods above 10% were seen in crisis eras for Rome or the USSR before its collapse.
Where is the U.S. now?
Around 3.5%, but again, the absolute cost of empire matters too. British and US revenue, for instance, covered only 35% of colonial costs. By 1930, it became a net drain. The U.S.-Afghanistan war, costing $2.3 trillion with negligible economic return, is a kind of modern parallel to consider.
Okay. What else economically?
Structural economic weaknesses are vital. Productivity growth stagnation is a clear sign. Spain had dismal 0.1% annual growth while its Dutch and English rivals were taking off.
And the U.S. recently.
Modern U.S. non-farm productivity growth fell to about 1.4% annually from 2010 to 2019, which is historically low. And the trade dependency ratio matters. The Ottomans relied on Europe for 70% of manufactured goods. Today, the U.S. imports, for example, 18% of critical minerals from China, creating potential vulnerabilities.
Right. Okay, shifting gears slightly, inequality metrics.
Yeah, social inequality and fragmentation can be measured. Metrics like the Gini coefficient or wealth concentration. A Gini above 0.50 often signals deep instability. We saw that in Rome before its crisis, or Britain around 1910.
And the U.S. now.
The modern U.S. Gini hit 0.52 in 2021, among the highest in the OECD group of developed nations.
Wow.
And the gap between elite and mass consumption is telling. Spanish nobles might earn 200 times peasant wages. Today, the U.S. top 1% hold about 32% of the wealth, while the bottom 50% hold just 2.6%. That's a huge gap.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
Okay, last indicator area.
Lastly, geopolitical leverage erosion. You can see this in a nation's share of global GDP. Britain fell from 24% in its heyday to around 3.8% now. The U.S. share has dropped from about 40% in 1960 to roughly 24% today, while China's has risen dramatically.
And technology.
The declining technological edge is also key. Spain famously banned some labor-saving tech. Today, you see reports that China leads the U.S. in certain critical areas like AI patents or 5G infrastructure.
So no single magic number, but...
Exactly. No single metric predicts collapse, but if you see 3 or more of these indicators consistently flashing red, let's say, it signals significant systemic risk.
That's a powerful set of numbers to track. But, it's not just about the numbers, is it? What about the actual human behaviors that make things worse? Do we see recurring patterns in how people act as empires decline?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The numbers tell part of the story, but the decline of empires reveals distinct patterns of human behavior that often amplify those structural weaknesses. You could almost call it the psychology of decline.
Okay, like what?
Well, one core pattern is elite hoarding and short-termism. Elites prioritize extracting immediate wealth over productive long-term investment.
Got an example.
Think of Roman latifundia owners buying luxury imports instead of reinvesting in better farming techniques. Or, arguably, today's U.S. corporate focus on stock buybacks versus declining investment in infrastructure or R&D.
Right. Short-sightedness.
Exactly. It stifles innovation and erodes the tax base needed for public goods.
What else?
Then there's institutional rigidity and reform resistance. This shows up as bureaucratic inertia, a stubborn clinging to outdated systems.
Like the Ottoman printing press ban.
Perfect example. Or Spain's persecution of scientists during the Enlightenment. We see modern parallels, perhaps, in lobbying efforts blocking crucial reforms, whether it's climate policy or education reform, simply because change disrupts existing power structures. This fundamentally blocks adaptation.
Makes sense. What's another pattern?
Social fragmentation and scapegoating is another clear one. Elites often retreat into their own bubbles, becoming alienated from the masses, like Roman patricians did in their grand villas. And under stress, societies often turn on themselves. They start blaming minorities for the decline. Think of Spain expelling Jews and Muslims in 1492, or, some of the anti-immigrant rhetoric we hear today in various places.
And that does what?
It undermines social trust. It fuels unrest. It makes collective action to solve the real problems basically impossible.
Okay. Any other key behaviors?
Cultural complacency and nostalgia is also very common. Empires often become obsessed with past glory.
How does that show up?
Like the Ottoman Devirim system, recruiting Christian boys for service, being maintained long after its military usefulness had faded. Or Britain's Victorian nostalgia, maybe preventing it from clearly seeing rising rivals.
It's like looking backwards instead of forwards.
Exactly. It's often performance over substance. Grandiose projects masking underlying decay, think Roman bread and circuses to distract from real problems. Or maybe slogans like, "Make America Great Again," sometimes acting as a substitute for actual difficult reforms. This diverts resources and delays necessary adaptation.
Okay, one more.
Finally, rent-seeking and corruption becomes rampant. Elites turn public institutions into patronage networks, like the Spanish crown selling colonial offices to the highest bidder.
Right, using the state for personal gain.
Pretty much. Military graft also cripples state capacity. You see it from the late Roman army's rotten supply chains to debates about waste in the modern military-industrial complex.
And what's the psychology behind all this? Why do people act this way?
Well, psychologists might point to things like loss aversion elites cling desperately to the status quo because they're terrified of losing privilege. There's also often a zero-sum mentality. See national wealth as a fixed pie to be fought over, rather than something that can be grown through investment and cooperation.
And division.
And tribal polarization. Under stress, societies fracture into competing identity groups, fighting for shrinking resources. This is key. Empires don't necessarily fail just because they face crises. They often fail because their human responses to those crises are tragically self-destructive.
Whereas adaptive societies.
Adaptive societies, in contrast, tend to prioritize investment over hoarding, pragmatism over dogma, solidarity over fragmentation, and maybe meritocracy over entrenched privilege.
That's a powerful observation. It really makes you wonder how much human nature itself plays into these grand historical outcomes. Okay, now let's bring in some of the big thinkers who've shaped our understanding of all this. Let's start with Adam Smith. How do his writings on imperialism fit into our discussion?
Adam Smith, writing back in The Wealth of Nations, offered some really profound critiques of empire, and many of them align strikingly with what we've been talking about regarding decline.
Okay. What was his main point?
His core argument really was that the cost of empire outweighs profit. He believed colonies were generally a net drain on the home country.
Why?
Mainly due to defense costs and the trade monopolies they created. He argued these monopolies actually inflated prices for consumers back home. This directly echoes what we saw with Spain's silver-funded military overstretch, or Britain's 20th century debt crisis.
Interesting. What else?
Smith also attacked mercantilism as self-defeating. That economic philosophy where nations tried to hoard gold and silver by exporting more than importing.
Right. Pile up the gold.
He saw it as zero-sum thinking that misallocated resources. It diverted capital away from productive domestic investment into trying to control trade routes or extract resources abroad. That pattern fits Spain's neglect of its own industry perfectly.
And monopolies.
He also warned that colonial monopolies breed inefficiency and corruption. He used the example of the British East India Company, which parallels things like Ottoman tax farming. And crucially, he saw military overextension weakening the core.
How so?
He argued it diverted resources from improving lands at home to defending distant possessions, creating fiscal fragility. Very similar to Rome's endless frontier wars.
He really saw through the glamour and pomp of empire, didn't he?
He absolutely did. And he anticipated many of the behavioral patterns we discussed, like elite capture. He famously said that merchants and manufacturers have generally an interest to deceive and even oppress the public.
Wow.
He condemned empires for prioritizing splendid trophies over long-term productivity, which echoes our discussion of short-termism and institutional rigidity.
But he was optimistic about free trade fixing things, wasn't he?
He was. He thought free trade would prevent this kind of decline. History shows that even post-imperial powers like Britain still declined, and new forms of economic domination emerged. But his diagnosis of imperial economics, especially the resource curse, the innovation drain, the social costs of elite extraction, remains incredibly relevant.
Okay. Moving from the classical to the revolutionary, what did Lenin add to this discussion of imperial decline? What was his core thesis?
Right. Lenin's Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, offers a completely different revolutionary critique. He argues that imperialism isn't just a policy choice empires make,
All right.
but an inevitable decaying phase of capitalism itself.
Okay. How does that work in his view?
For Lenin, imperialism merges when industrial capital merges with banks, creating these giant finance capital monopolies. His first core thesis is that this breeds monopoly finance capital and stagnation.
Stagnation. Why?
Because capital starts seeking higher profits abroad through colonialism and foreign investment, instead of innovating and investing domestically. Think of Britain's late 19th century technological lag behind the rising U.S. and Germany.
Okay. Sending money overseas instead of building at home.
Exactly. Which leads to a second point, parasitism and the rentier state. He argued imperial powers increasingly profit from overseas investments just collecting rent, essentially while deindustrializing at home.
Like clipping coupons.
Precisely. By 1914, Britain actually earned twice as much from foreign investments as from its domestic exports. Lenin said this parasitism erodes industrial capacity, making empires deeply vulnerable.
Okay. What else?
His third major point was that once the whole globe is carved up by empires, territorial division leads to inevitable war for redivision. He saw World War I as a direct result of this empires fighting over colonies and spheres of influence. And these wars, of course, accelerate fiscal crises and expose imperial weaknesses.
So, for Lenin, decline wasn't just a mistake or bad luck, but actually a built-in feature of capitalism itself. It had to happen.
Precisely. He saw it as an inherent contradiction that would inevitably lead to collapse.
Yeah.
He didn't stop there, though.
Go on.
He further argued that superexploitation fuels anti-imperial revolt. Extracting those super profits from colonies requires brutal repression, which eventually sparks nationalist movements. These movements raise the administrative costs and lower the profits of empire.
Making it unsustainable.
Right. And finally, uneven development guarantees challengers. Capitalism develops unevenly across the globe, constantly creating new rivals that inevitably challenge and dismantle existing hegemonies. Today's dominant power is tomorrow's has-been, in his view.
Can we see his model in history?
Well, you can certainly see elements. The British Empire's increasing reliance on finance, its parasitism, and how WWI really triggered its decline fits parts of his model. The late Ottoman Empire becoming a kind of semi-colony dominated by European finance capital also resonates.
And for today?
Applying it to modern U.S. hegemony. Proponents might point to financialization as a form of rentierism and the U.S.-China rivalry as echoing his redivision thesis. Of course, critics argue he underestimated capitalism's adaptability and maybe overstated the inevitability of revolution. But his diagnosis of imperialism's eventually self-destructive DNA aligns strongly with many historical patterns of decline.
Okay, so we've had Smith on economics, Lenin on capitalism's structure. Let's shift from economics and politics to the realm of culture and ideas. How does Edward Said expand our view of imperial decline? What new lens does he offer?
Edward Said, especially in his groundbreaking work Orientalism, added a crucial cultural dimension. His core argument is that empires don't just dominate militarily or economically. They dominate culturally by constructing fantasies about the peoples they colonize.
Fantasies. How so?
He turned this Orientalism, this body of knowledge, stereotypes, and assumptions that Western scholars, artists, and officials produced about the Orient, meaning the Middle East and Asia mostly. These were often simplified, exoticized, sometimes dehumanizing stereotypes.
And this served a purpose.
Absolutely. It served to justify colonial rule, portraying the colonized as irrational, backward, needing to be civilized or controlled. He called this the knowledge-power nexus. Controlling the narrative is a form of power.
But how does this relate to decline?
Because this cultural construction doesn't just oppress the colonized, it fundamentally blinds the empire itself. Empires start believing their own propaganda. They fail to understand the realities, the perspectives, the resilience of the people they rule. This leads to profound strategic miscalculations.
Like Britain with Indian nationalism.
Exactly. Or France insisting Algeria was inherently French soil, completely ignoring Algerian identity and history, which led to a brutal, unwinnable war of independence. This cultural arrogance leads to what Sihar called strategic blindness. Empires assume their worldview is universal. They dismiss anti-colonial resistance as just irrational chaos or primitive barbarism instead of understanding its roots. Said also suggested that the empire's obsession with defining and controlling the other often served as a kind of mirror, reflecting its own internal fragility and anxieties about its own identity and perhaps impending decline.
This suggests empires might be blind, almost willfully blind, to their own impending doom, doesn't it? That they create a reality that prevents them from seeing the truth.
It absolutely does. Said shows how empires lose moral authority, often from within. British India was justified by a civilizing mission, right? But figures like Gandhi brilliantly exposed the hypocrisy, the empire's own double standards.
Turning their own values against them.
Precisely. The Ottoman Empire, similarly, was framed by Europeans as the sick man of Europe, a convenient trope that justified European interference and hastened its fragmentation. Even looking at the U.S. and Vietnam or Iraq, Said's followers would argue that viewing locals through these Orientalist blinders contributed significantly to policy disasters.
So what are the structures of decline, Said highlights?
He points to things like self-defeating universalism empires preach universal values like liberty or democracy, but deny them to colonized peoples, which inevitably fuels fierce resistance. And ironically, the cultural mixing that does occur under empire, what post-colonial theorists call hybridity, often creates new, powerful, anti-imperial identities that the empire can't understand or contain.
So culture isn't just fluff, it's central to the power dynamics and the eventual collapse.
Exactly. While political economy might explain how empires fall, the mechanics of it, Said helps explain why they often never see it coming, blinded by their own cultural arrogance and strategic illiteracy.
Fascinating. Okay, bring this to a more structural Marxist perspective. How does Smiramin contribute to understanding imperial decline? What's his core idea?
Smiramin takes a broader world systems view. He fundamentally argued that imperialism isn't just a phase, like Lenin said, but a permanent inherent feature of global capitalism, driven by what he called unequal development.
Unequal development, what does that mean?
It means capitalism doesn't develop the world evenly. Instead, it actively underdevelops the peripheries, the exploited nations, mostly in the global south, in order to enrich the cores, the imperial powers.
How does it do that?
Through mechanisms like resource extraction and asymmetric trade, peripheries are forced to export low-value raw materials and agricultural goods while importing high-value manufactured goods from the core. This creates a constant drain of value, of wealth, from the periphery to the core.
Okay.
This, in turn, eventually shrinks the potential markets for the core's goods, leading to stagnation and crisis in the imperial core itself. It's a contradiction.
So the exploitation eventually backfires.
In Amin's view, yes. He introduced concepts like the law of worldwide value, arguing that wages in the peripheries are kept artificially low, far below their actual productivity, to boost profits in the core. This difference he called imperialist rent, an extra profit stream extracted by imperial powers.
And this rent is maintained how?
Through what Amin called the 5 monopolies held by the core. The monopoly of technology, control over global finance, privileged access to natural resources, control over media and communication, and the monopoly of weapons of mass destruction.
And decline happens when?
Decline happens when these monopolies start to erode, when peripheral nations begin to develop their own technology, challenge financial dominance, reclaim resources, or build alternative narratives.
So Amin sees this fundamental built-in polarization between core and periphery that ultimately undermines empires. Capitalism creates its own undoing through this structure.
Exactly. For Amin, this polarization is capitalism's engine, but also its fatal structural flaw. The constant extraction is necessary for core profit, but it inevitably breeds resistance and instability.
Did he propose a solution?
He did. He advocated for delinking as an anti-imperial strategy. This means peripheral nations should consciously break their dependent ties with the capitalist world system through things like prioritizing internal development, building regional cooperation, South-South cooperation, controlling foreign investment, and pursuing more self-reliant, often socialist-oriented policies. This delinking, in turn, would deprive the imperial cores of cheap labor, resources, and markets, thereby accelerating their decline.
How does his view explain historical declines?
Well, Amin's framework can explain how the British Empire's wealth was built on extracting value from places like India and how its decline was triggered, in part, when nationalist movements began to delink by reclaiming resources and markets. He was also critical of the Soviet Union, arguing it created its own form of imperialism through unequal exchange within its sphere of influence.
And applying it to the U.S. today.
Applying it to modern U.S. hegemony, one might see Amin's monopoly decay in action as China challenges U.S. technological dominance, or as countries explore de-dollarization challenging financial control. The extreme financialization of the U.S. economy could be seen as what he'd call an over-accumulation crisis, where capital floods Wall Street seeking speculative profits because productive investment opportunities reliant on peripheral markets are stagnating.
Any criticisms of Amin?
Yes, critics often argued his delinking strategy was perhaps utopian or impractical in a globalized world, and some felt he might have underestimated cultural factors or the agency of actors within the core itself. But his core insights into the structural contradictions of global capitalism, and particularly how resistance from the peripheries can be a key driver of imperial decline, remain really powerful.
What's really fascinating here is how these, quite grand abstract theories can find echoes in very specific, very local struggles, like those happening in Gaelic communities today in places like Scotland and Ireland. Can you connect those dots for us?
Yeah, it's a truly compelling connection, and one that's being actively discussed within those communities. Modern Gaelic critiques of imperialism resonate deeply with Amin's theories, even if they don't always use his exact terminology.
How so?
Well, they view unequal development not just as purely economic exploitation, but as a form of sustained cultural warfare too. Historical events like the Highland clearances in Scotland, the forced displacement of Gaelic-speaking Highlanders from their land, aren't just seen as tragic history, but as a deliberate dismantling of a different social and economic system to make way for large-scale sheep farming, which served English industrial markets. That's classic core periphery extraction in Amin's terms.
And language.
Linguistic domination, like the historical suppression of Gaelic in schools and public life, is seen as cultural extraction, stripping away identity and connection to land. The land itself is often viewed as a stolen commons, enclosed and privatized for external profit, echoing Amin's critique of how capitalism breaks down pre-capitalist communal systems.
So for these communities, delinking isn't just an abstract theory.
Not at all. For them, delinking means actively building cultural and economic sovereignty. It means taking back control over land, language, resources, and their own future. It's very practical.
Can you give us some concrete examples? How are Gaelic communities actually doing this kind of delinking?
Okay, yeah, there's some really powerful examples. Let's take the Isle of Eigg in Scotland. It's a small island. In 1997, its residents famously mounted a community buyout, crowdfunding, to purchase the island from its absentee landlord.
Wow, taking ownership.
Exactly. But they didn't stop there. In 2008, they launched Eigg Electric. It's a community-owned, completely off-grid, renewable energy system.
Off-grid?
It's powered entirely by a mix of wind, small-scale hydro, and solar PV, with battery storage. This directly delinked them from relying on expensive, polluting energy from the UK mainland grid, controlled by large corporations.
And the impact?
It's been transformative. It eradicated fuel poverty on the island, provides stable, affordable green energy, retains value locally, and has been credited with reversing depopulation. The population has actually grown significantly. It's a remarkable act of energy sovereignty, directly defying the finance and resource monopolies Amin talked about.
That's incredible. Any other examples?
Another great one comes from Glencomsil in the Donegal Gaeltacht in Ireland. Starting in the 1950s, a local priest, Father James McDyer, led efforts to combat severe depopulation and economic decline.
What do?
They established a series of community-owned cooperatives focusing on farming, fishing, local crafts, tourism. Crucially, they focused on maintaining the Irish language as the community's working language, setting up Irish medium immersive schools, and protecting affordable housing stock from being bought up as holiday homes.
So linking culture and economy.
Absolutely. It was about creating a viable Gaelic economy, a linguistic cultural commons, resisting the pull of assimilation and economic extraction by the Anglophone core. It's about cultural delinking as much as economic delinking.
Okay, one more. Maybe focused on land.
Yes, the Essen crofters in Sutherland, Scotland. Crofters are essentially small-scale tenant farmers with specific land rights. In 1992, facing the prospect of their estate being broken up and sold off by a bankrupt foreign speculator,
They did what?
they organized. The Essen Crofters Trust was formed, and they managed, against the odds, to collectively purchase 21,000 acres of their ancestral land.
Another community buyout.
Yes, one of the first big ones. They established the Ascent Foundation to democratically govern the land. Now, they provide affordable crofts specifically to keep young Gaelic families in the area. They're undertaking significant native woodland regeneration rewilding, and they run an eco-arts center focused on Gaelic ecology.
So fighting back against finance capital.
Directly. It's land warfare against finance capital, you could say. They smashed the rentier monopoly over their land and resources, replacing external control with democratic community governance. It's about reversing historical extraction and taking control of their means of subsistence, very much in line with Amin's vision of local control breaking core dominance.
How do these movements connect to Amin's 5 monopolies?
Well, Ig breaks the energy resource monopoly. Glenn Comsill challenges the cultural narrative monopoly by centering the Irish language. Assent directly tackles the finance and resource monopolies over land. They might not explicitly use Amin's framework, but they are intuitively, practically challenging those pillars of external control. They also innovate in uniquely Gaelic ways, linking land rights to language revitalization or energy sovereignty to community cohesion.
It really is inspiring to see these communities actively shaping their own futures, pushing back against these larger forces. What's the bigger picture here, though? Are these isolated examples?
It truly is inspiring. And while they face huge challenges, they aren't entirely isolated. These Gaelic movements often consciously link up with other peripheral communities globally who are fighting similar battles.
Really? How?
For instance, AIG has shared its solar microgrid designs and community ownership models with communities in places like Zapatista-controlled Chiapas in Mexico or villages in Malawi. There's a growing network, often informal, of communities sharing strategies for self-determination, for delinking, building alternatives from the ground up.
Exactly. They're demonstrating that even small communities can begin to challenge the dominance of the core by taking back control of their land, their energy, their culture, their narratives. It shows that imperial decline, in Amin's sense, truly begins when peripheries stop passively feeding the core and start actively owning and shaping their own local systems.
Of course, it's not easy, is it? Oh, absolutely not. The challenges are immense. There's the constant pressure of neoliberal recapture corporations trying to co-opt community energy schemes, for instance.
Yeah.
There's the risk of language commodification, where Gaelic culture gets turned into just another brand. And ongoing issues like depopulation in remote areas are still very real. But these communities demonstrate that resistance is possible and that decline for the core can mean regeneration for the periphery.
So, to try and bring this all together for you, our listener, after that wide-ranging discussion, the overarching lesson seems clear. Empires fall. They fall when they can no longer adapt economically while maintaining political control. And crucially, when their human responses to the inevitable crises become tragically self-destructive. It's not just a list of separate problems, is it? It's this kind of destructive feedback loop we talked about.
Indeed. And perhaps the final thought to leave you with is this. Maybe imperialism isn't doomed primarily by moral failure, though the moral arguments are strong. Maybe it's doomed by a kind of mathematical inevitability.
How so?
Because it fundamentally violates the core principles of sustainable systems. It relies on constant expansion and extraction, ignoring negative feedback loops. It pushes past the point of diminishing marginal returns. Ultimately, it tries to extract more value than it reinvests or allows to regenerate, leading eventually to an almost inevitable internal collapse or fragmentation. It's unsustainable by design.
A provocative thought indeed. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the political economy of imperial decline. We hope this exploration gives you some new lenses, some new ways to view history, and perhaps even the present day unfolding around us. Keep digging, keep questioning, and keep exploring these critical themes.